The office was always so quiet after he left for the day. That was my time. The cleaning crew would come through the hum of the vacuum in the hallway, and I'd be at my desk, finishing up the reports. He'd take credit, for in the morning meeting it was a partnership he called it. But it felt more like a shadow. I was the one who understood the clients, the one who found the inefficiencies in the supply chain, the one who drafted the proposals, that won the big contracts. But my name was never on the door. It was always we when we succeeded, and I when he spoke to the board. I repeated the process. One client led to another through word of mouth. My little venture was building a reputation for being relentless, precise, and effective, all while I sat across the dinner table from him, listening to him talk about his struggles, maintaining the perfect facade of the supportive wife. Deeper, what is the life you are trying to build for yourself, completely independent of that person? What does freedom look like to you? Is it financial independence? Is it creative control? Is it the respect of your peers? Write that down. This is your core motivation. This is your North Star. The anger is the rocket booster. But this core motivation is the destination. Now let's make it visual. A vision board. This isn't just a collage of nice pictures. This is a concrete visualization of your target. If your goal is to buy a specific company, find a picture of its logo, its headquarters. If your goal is a certain income level, find an image that represents that lifestyle, not in a frivolous way, but in a tangible way. What does that security feel like? Is it a deed to a house? Is it a quiet morning with coffee, where you don't have to answer to anyone? Put that board. The key is to look at this board every single day. It programs your subconscious to recognize opportunities that align with this vision. It moves the goal from an abstract idea in your head to a tangible reality you are working towards. This first step is the most important. Without this internal shift, the external actions will lack conviction. You're building your foundation, make it solid. Okay, the mindset is set now. We get tactical. This step is about moving from emotion to cold hard analysis. You have a target. In my case, it was my husband's company. Yours might be a competitor's business, a job you were passed over for a market you want to dominate. We need to conduct a strategic audit. First, assess the competition objectively. This is not about their character, it's about their business. Get their financials, if they're a public, or make educated estimates. If they're a private, what are their revenue streams? Where are their clients? What are their strengths? Maybe they have a great brand reputation. But what are their weaknesses? Are they slow to adapt? Is their technology outdated? Is their customer service poor? Create a SWOT analysis for them. Strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, threats. Be dispassionate. This is like studying a map before a battle. Now turn the lens on yourself. This is your unique advantage worksheet. On one side, list all your skills. Don't be modest. Are you a great negotiator, a creative marketer? Do you have deep industry knowledge? On another side, list your network. Who do you know? Former colleagues, mentors, suppliers, clients. This is your arsenal. Finally, list your differentiators. What can you do better than them? Maybe it's your agility as a smaller operator. Maybe it's your fresh perspective. Maybe it's your personal connection to the product or service. This is your competitive edge. This is what you will leverage. Finally, we build the plan. A dream without a plan is just a wish. You need a phased business plan. Start with a 90-day plan. This is your launch phase. What are the absolute critical milestones? Maybe it's securing your first 3 clients. Maybe it's building a prototype. Make these milestones specific and measurable. Get better is not a milestone. Acquire 5 new customers by the end of quarter 1 is a milestone. Then build out your 6-month plan. This is your stabilization phase. Where should your revenue be? The turning point came about 2 years in. My company, Apex Logistics Solutions, was still small, but it was a sharp, precise instrument. I hired my first employee, a brilliant young data analyst. My husband had interviewed and rejected for being too quiet. I gave her a problem, and she solved it in ways he would never have conceived. We started to expand, not wildly, but strategically. We offered services that directly complemented what his company did, but we did them better, faster, cheaper. What systems should be in place? Then your 1-year plan. This is your growth phase. This is where you aim to be in a position of strength, ready for the next move. This plan is your roadmap. It will change, and that's fine, but you must have a map to start the journey. The foundation is poured, the blueprint is drawn. Now, we need the engine that will power everything. Capital, money. This is where many great ideas fail, so we need to be disciplined and smart from day one. The first big decision: bootstrapping versus seeking funding. Bootstrapping means funding the business yourself from your savings. And its early profits, the pro, you retain complete control. You answer to no one. The con, growth can be slower. It's a marathon. Seeking funding from angels or venture capitalists means injecting cash to grow fast. The pro, you can scale quickly. The con, you give up equity and control. You now have bosses, investors to report to for my goal, which was ultimately an acquisition. Bootstrapping was the only way I needed to show that the business was fundamentally strong on its own, that it didn't need his infrastructure to survive. I needed to build my own. Which leads to financial discipline. You need to track every single penny from the start. Set up a simple but rigorous system. A spreadsheet is fine. Every expense, no matter how small, gets logged. Every bit of income is recorded. This isn't just for taxes. This is for intelligence. You need to know your unit economics. What does it cost to acquire a customer? What is the lifetime value of that customer? This data is power. It allows you to maximize your ROI. Y'all see clearly which marketing channels work and which are wasting money. Y'all know exactly where to reinvest. And reinvest you must. This is the growth flywheel. In the early days, every profit should be looked at as fuel for growth, not as a paycheck. Can you reinvest that money into a better marketing campaign, into hiring a part-time assistant to free you up for more strategic work, into improving your product? This systematic reinvestment is what creates compound growth. It starts slow, but each turn of the flywheel makes the next turn easier and faster. You're building momentum. You're building an entity that can stand on its own, an entity that is becoming formidable. The engine is humming. You have a profitable, growing business. Now, it's time for the final move, the acquisition playbook. This is where strategy meets opportunity. First, timing is everything. You need to recognize when the target is vulnerable. Look for signs. Are their sales stagnating or declining? Is there news of internal strife? Have they lost a key client? Are they taking on debt? In my case, I watched from a distance. I saw the arrogance of success lead to complacency. The company stopped innovating. Customer complaints were rising. These are signals. The market doesn't lie. When you see these cracks, that's your window. I started to see the names of his key accounts appearing in our potential client list, and we started winning them not by badmouthing him, but by simply being better. Next, how to structure the deal. This sounds complex, but let's simplify it. There are three main ways. An asset purchase is where you buy only the parts of the company you want: the client list, the equipment, the brand name. You leave behind any liabilities or debts. This is often the safest route. A stock purchase is where you buy the entire company, lock, stock and barrel, including all its assets and all its liabilities. This is riskier, but can be necessary if you need the whole entity intact. Then there's leveraged buyout. This is the most aggressive move. This is where you use the target company's own assets as collateral to borrow the money to buy it. It's high risk, high reward. For most people starting out, an asset purchase is the most straightforward path. You're buying the valuable pieces, not the baggage. Finally, the negotiation mindset. This is the ultimate test of your step 1 mindset shift. You must stay dispassionate. You cannot negotiate from a place of emotion, of hurt, of a desire for revenge. You negotiate from a place of numbers. The history between you is irrelevant at the negotiating table. What is the company worth objectively? What are its assets? What is its earning potential? That is the only conversation. Any mention of the past, any emotional jab, is a tactic to throw you off balance. Your response is always to bring it back to the numbers. That's not relevant to the valuation. Let's look at the Q3 earnings report. This is where you win, not by yelling, but by being the most prepared, calm, and logical person in the room. You are not the scorned partner anymore. You are a serious businessperson executing a transaction. The papers are signed, the deal is done, you own it. And the silence after the applause is the most profound sound you will ever hear, because the victory isn't in the ownership. It's in the journey. It's in every journal entry, every tracked expense, every negotiated term. They told you that you'd never make it without them. And you didn't. You made it with someone far more reliable. You made it with yourself. The papers were spread across the entire dining table, our dining table. It felt strange seeing our life reduced to columns of assets and liabilities. The house, the cars, the joint investment accounts, it was all there in black and white. But then there was the other part, the part that wasn't so easily quantified: his company, the one he said I could never understand, the one he built. Or at least that was the story he told himself. And everyone else. My lawyer Sarah had a way of cutting through the noise. Shed point to a line item And say this is community property, the appreciation of his shares during the marriage, that's yours too. It was a clinical dissection of a life wedge shared. But the real question, the ethical one, was about everything that wasn't on paper. The knowledge. I had the industry contacts Id made, alongside him at countless dinners and charity events, the understanding of his business weaknesses, the little operational cracks I'd seen over the years, but never voiced, because that wasn't my role. My role was to be the supportive wife. Sarah was clear. Using publicly available information is one thing. Using his private strategic plans that you saw on his home office desk is another. That's a line we cannot cross. So I had to draw my own map. Right down the middle. His contacts were off limits, at least directly. But the general knowledge of the market, the landscape, that was mine. It felt like walking a tightrope. Every decision had to be filtered through this new lens. Is this smart business? Or is it personal? Am I building something, or am I just trying to tear his down? Then I started my own firm, a smaller, leaner version targeting a niche he had overlooked. The legal definition of fair competition kept me up at night. I'd read cases about tortious interference, did sending a general announcement to an industry newsletter count as poaching. I was so careful I hired a headhunter to find my first employees, making sure none of them came directly from his roster. But the perception that was harder to control. The whispers started almost immediately. It's the scorned. I'll never forget the day I saw our company name mentioned in an industry report alongside his. It was a footnote, just a blip. But it was their parody. We were being spoken of in the same breath. Around that same time, the cracks in his foundation began to show. He'd come home tense, talking about client attrition, about morale problems in the office, about pressure from the board. He couldn't understand it. He was working harder than ever, but he was fighting the last war. He was trying to muscle through problems. Wife, they'd say, she's out for blood. I had to be better, smarter, more ethical than anyone else. My product had to be superior on its own merits. My customer service had to be impeccable. There could be no room for the accusation that I was winning clients just because of our history. Every night I'd sit alone in my new apartment and replay the day's decisions. That aggressive pricing model I proposed for a new client. Was that sound strategy, knowing it would undercut his bid, or was it spite dressed up in a spreadsheet? I had to have an answer for myself. I had to be able to look in the mirror and know that I was building a real company, not just a monument to my anger. It was exhausting, this constant internal audit of my own motives. But it was the only way to ensure I didn't become the vindictive caricature he had predicted. The day my investment banker called and said the company was in play, that a private equity firm was sniffing around my stomach, drop this, was the moment. The ultimate gray area. I had to disclose our relationship immediately. There was no choice. The conflict of interest was too profound. So we used intermediaries. My bank approached his board's special committee. My name was kept out of it. Initially, it was just an offer from a holding company. I controlled the process, was sterile, by the book, data rooms, due diligence, all of it handled by layers of professionals. But I knew the moment he found out it was me. The fair valuation was the most critical part. We paid a premium, more than the private equity firm was offering. It had to be unassailable. I had my own team of analysts separate from my bankers, triple checking the numbers. I needed to be able to stand in front of a judge if it came to that, and prove that we paid a fair, even generous price, that this wasn't a fire sale driven by personal animosity. The negotiations were tense. His lawyers tried everything to block the deal, citing the personal history. But the board's fiduciary duty was to the shareholders to get the best value, and our offer was the best value in the end. The cold, hard logic of the balance sheet won out over his outrage. Signing those papers was the most surreal experience of my life. The pen felt heavy. I was acquiring the very symbol of his dismissal of me, but there was no joy in it, just a profound, quiet gravity. The day the deal closed, the real work began. The first thing I did was restructure the board. I brought in entirely new independent directors, people with impeccable reputations, who had no connection to either of us. I needed their objectivity. I needed them to be a check on me, to ensure every decision was for the health of the combined company, not for some personal satisfaction. Then I addressed the employees. The fear in that first all-hands meeting was palpable. They had seen the headlines. They thought was there to dismantle everything he had built out of spite. I stood before them and laid out my plan. There would be no wholesale firings. Their jobs were safe. Their benefits would remain, and in some cases, improve. I spoke about the strengths of the company, the legacy of the brand, and how we would build on it together. I talked about my new company's technology, and how integrating it would make us stronger. I saw the skepticism slowly turn to cautious optimism. It was the hardest speech I've ever given. I had to project a confidence. I wasn't sure. I felt I had to convince them that I was a leader, not just an ex-wife. The final test came later. He had a golden parachute, a generous severance package. That was part of his old contract. My new board advised me that we could likely challenge it, find a way to reduce the payout. Based on technicalities, it would have been legally defensible maybe. And a part of me, a small bitter part, wanted to do it, to give him a taste of being told he wouldn't make it. But I thought about it for a long time. I thought about the kind of person I wanted to be. I thought about the company I was trying to build, its culture, its values. Vengeance is a terrible business strategy. It clouds your judgment. So I instructed the lawyers to honor the contract in full, every last dollar. It wasn't about him. It was about me. It was about proving to myself more than anyone that I had made it without him, not by becoming a ruthless version of him, but by becoming a better version of myself. The victory wasn't in buying the company. The victory was in being able to run it with a clear conscience to look at. That required finesse and intelligence. The market was shifting, and he was being left behind. I'd listen, and I'd nod. And inside, I felt nothing but a calm, steady certainty. What we had built together, the employees whose livelihoods depended on these decisions, and know that I was steering the ship with a steady hand, not a clenched fist. The moment the wire transfer went through, the final payment to him, I felt a stillness. The noise of the battle just faded away. He was wrong. I did make it without him. But more importantly, I made it without becoming the person he accused me of being, and that was the only thing that truly mattered. You have to understand, he was magnetic. When I first met him, it was like the sun had decided to walk into the room. He had this confidence, this absolute certainty about the way the world worked. And for a long time I was just happy to be in his orbit. He made the decisions, he picked the restaurants, he explained the stock market to me over dinner, his voice so patient-like. He was teaching a child a simple card trick. I didn't mind it. Then I think I found it comforting to have someone who seemed to have all the answers. The charm, it had a flip side. It was in the little things, the things you could almost explain away if you tried hard enough. The way he'd finish my sentences, not to be helpful, but because he was sure he knew what I was going to say. The way he'd wave a hand if I started talking about my day at work, a dismissive little gesture. "That's cute, honey," he'd say. "But that's not how real business works." He'd say it with a smile, you see, always with a smile. So you couldn't call him cruel, you couldn't point to it. It was just a constant, gentle pressure. A pressure that said your world is small, and mine is large, and you should be grateful I let you into mine. The company was his life. He built it from nothing, and he was proud of it, and he should have been. But it became this third person in our marriage. He'd come home, and his mind was still there in that office with those numbers. I'd try to talk to him about an idea. I had something I'd been researching, and he'd listen for a minute. Then his eyes would glaze over. He'd start talking about a merger. He was engineering a competitor he was crushing. It was like I was speaking a different language, one he couldn't be bothered to learn. The argument, the big one, it didn't come out of nowhere. It was a pressure cooker. And he turned up the heat. I'd been offered a consulting gig, a real one. A firm wanted my perspective on a project. And it was a significant amount of money. I was excited. I remember my hands were shaking a little when I told him. I laid it all out, the proposal, the numbers. I thought he'd be proud. He listened, he actually listened. And then he laughed. It wasn't a cruel laugh, not exactly, it was worse. It was a laugh of genuine, baffled amusement, like a cat had just walked into the room wearing a tiny hat. He shook his head and put his glass down. "Oh, sweetheart," he said, "that's a nice little fantasy, but be realistic. The stress alone would break you. You're not built for that kind of fight." I felt my face get hot. I told him he was wrong. I told him I'd been preparing for this, that I knew more than he thought I did. My voice was rising. I could hear it. And that just seemed to amuse him more. He leaned back in his chair, a king on his throne. And he delivered the line, the one that changed everything. He said, "Y'all never make it without me." He said it so calmly, so finally. It wasn't an insult. It was a statement of fact in his mind. It was as true as saying the sky is blue. That was the moment. When his company's financials started to look truly precarious, I knew it was time. I worked through my intermediaries, my lawyer, my financial advisor. They made an initial anonymous offer to purchase a controlling stake. It was a lowball offer. But it was serious. I knew he was desperate. The negotiations were tense, even from a distance. his representatives tried to play hardball, but they had no leverage. The numbers were the numbers. My team was instructed to be firm, fair, and utterly clinical. This was a glass shattered. The polite smiling facade we'd been living in just cracked apart. I didn't scream, I didn't cry, I just looked at him, at this man, who had shared my bed for a decade. And I saw a stranger, a condescending, utterly confident stranger. And I made a decision right there in that quiet, expensive kitchen. It was a cold, clear decision. I was going to prove him wrong, not just a little wrong. I was going to take the one thing he loved most, the thing he thought I could never understand, and I was going to make it mine. The pursuit was all-consuming. I threw myself into it, with a focus I didn't know I possessed. I hired lawyers, who were sharks, the kind he would have hired. I spent nights poring over financial documents, company bylaws, shareholder agreements. My old life just fell away. Friends called, and I didn't return the calls. My family worried. But it was like I was wearing blinders. The only thing that mattered was the goal, the acquisition. I told myself it was about justice, about proving my own worth. But there were moments in the dead of night when I'd wake up, and the feeling wasn't righteous, it was hungry, it was annoying, insatiable hunger. I remember my lawyer, a sharp woman, named Amanda, looking at me across a table strewn with papers. She said, "You know, there are cleaner ways to do this, less aggressive. He might be more willing to negotiate." I cut her off. I didn't want negotiation, I wanted a takeover. I wanted a conquest. I framed it as strength. I was done being the reasonable one, the accommodating one. But was it strength, or was it something else, something closer to an obsession? I started to hear things through the grapevine, that he was blindsided, that he couldn't believe it was me behind the hostile bids, that he was telling people I had misunderstood him, that he'd never meant to hurt me. I dismissed it as weakness, as his typical manipulation. But once I got a letter from his sister, a woman I'd always liked. She wrote that he was devastated, that he felt like he was losing his mind, because the woman he loved was systematically dismantling his life's work, and he couldn't understand why. She asked me to call her. I threw the letter away. I told myself she was just a pawn that he had sent her, but the words stuck with me. The woman he loved. Did he love me? Or did he love the idea of me, the supportive wife who stayed in the background? The questions were dangerous, they were cracks in my resolve. So I buried them. I worked harder. The day it was finalized, I expected to feel a surge of triumph. I expected to feel whole. I sat in the boardroom, the same boardroom I'd waited in for him so many times. And I signed the papers, my signature next to his. His was shaky, mine was firm. There was a silence after the lawyers left. He was still sitting across the table. He looked older, the confidence was gone, completely eroded. He just looked tired and sad. He didn't yell, he didn't accuse me, he just looked at me. And his voice was quiet. Why, he asked, was it really worth all of this to prove a point? I had a speech prepared. I was going to list every dismissal, every patronizing comment, every time he made me feel small. But looking at him, then the speech turned to ash in my mouth. I just said, "You told me I'd never make it without you." He nodded slowly, like he was finally seeing a piece of a puzzle he'd been missing. "I was wrong," he said. And then he stood up and left. He had a dignity in his defeat that I hadn't anticipated. It made my victory feel cheap. It felt hollow. Transaction, it was about assets and client lists and intellectual property. It was not about the past. The first time I walked into the CEO office, as the owner, it was surreal. His things were gone, the framed awards, the golf clubs in the corner, the expensive pen set. It was just an empty, elegant room, my room. I sat behind the desk. It was larger than I remembered. The leather chair creaked under my weight. I looked out the window at the city, the same view he had looked at for 20 years. People congratulated me. They called me ruthless, brilliant, a force of nature. I smiled and accepted it. But the silence in that office was immense. I had done it. I had made it without him. So why did it feel so empty? The goal had been so all-consuming that I hadn't thought about what came after, the day-to-day running of a company I had acquired out of spite, the meetings, the decisions, the pressure. It was everything he said it would be, and I was alone in it. I found a small box he'd left behind in a drawer. It was just miscellaneous things, paperclips, a spare key, a forgotten flash drive. And there was a photograph tucked away at the bottom. It was a picture of us from years ago on a vacation. We were both laughing, really laughing. His arm was around me, and I was leaning into him. We looked happy, genuinely happy. I stared at that photo for a long time. Was that real, or was that just another part of the illusion? Had I been so focused on the bad moments that I erased the good ones? Had I become the villain in his story, just as he had become the villain in mine. Now I sit here in this office, I have everything I thought I wanted, the power, the title, the respect I won. But the question lingers hanging in the quiet air, who really won? Did I free myself? Or did I just build a different kind of prison? One of my own making. He told me I'd never make it without him. And I did, but making it feels so different than I thought it would. It feels like being the last one standing in an empty room wondering if the fight was ever really necessary at all. The world didn't end with a bang. It ended with a sentence. We were in the kitchen, the same kitchen, where I'd made 1,000 breakfasts, packed 1,000 lunches. The air still smelled of the coffee I'd brewed for him. He was standing by the island, not even looking at me, just scrolling through something on his phone. And he said it so casually, so matter-of-factly, like he was commenting on the weather. Y'all never make it without me. It wasn't shouted, it wasn't even angry. That was the thing that made it so devastating. It was just a statement of what he believed to be a simple universal truth, like saying water is wet. And in that moment, the entire architecture of my life collapsed, because my life, my entire identity was built around him. I wasn't Sarah, I was his wife. I was the organizer of his calendar, the hostess of his parties, the quiet support behind his ambitions. I had polished his success, until it shone so brightly. It blinded everyone, including me, to the fact that I had none of my own. His words weren't just an insult, they were a spiritual death. They killed the person I thought I was. The days and weeks that followed were a kind of fog. I moved through the house like a ghost. I'd look in the mirror and see a stranger. Who was I if I wasn't his wife? What was my purpose? If it was to prop him up? The silence in the house was deafening. It was a hollow, empty silence that echoed the hollowness I felt inside. I felt completely disconnected from everything, from meaning, from hope, from any sense that life could be different. It was a dark night of the soul that seemed to have no dawn. I was just lost. Boat cut loose from its mooring, drifting in a sea of nothing. The day of the signing was held in a sterile conference room in a law firm downtown. I arrived separately. He had no idea I would be there. I walked in just as the final documents were being laid out on the table. He was sitting there looking tired, diminished. He looked up, and the confusion on his face was almost pitiable. Then it shifted to disbelief, and then to a dawning, horrifying understanding. I knew I couldn't stay in that emptiness. It was going to consume me, so I started to do something I hadn't done in 20 years. I started to sit with myself in the quiet of the morning. Before the sun was up, I would just sit, no music, no phone, no distractions. Just me and the silence. It was terrifying at first, all the fears, all the voices telling me I was nothing without him. They were so loud. But I kept sitting. I started seeing a therapist, not to talk about him, but to talk about me too. Excavate the person who had been buried under the role of the wife. It was a process of letting go. I had to consciously, deliberately release the story I'd been telling myself, the story of us, the story of me as an extension of him. It was like shedding a heavy, worn-out coat that I'd mistaken for my own skin. And underneath, there was something raw and tender. But it was real. I began to understand that my value wasn't something he had given me, and therefore couldn't take away. It was intrinsic. It was there all along, just covered in layers of other people's expectations. I started to remember things. I was good at things I enjoyed before I met him. A clarity started to emerge, not from ambition, but from a quiet place of wanting to be of service, to create something meaningful. The idea for the business didn't come as a flash of revenge. It came softly during one of those quiet mornings. I saw a gap in the market, a way to do something better, more ethically, more in line with what people actually needed. It felt like a calling. It was born from a genuine desire to build, to contribute. This was my purpose, emerging from the ashes of the old life. It had nothing to do with him. Building the company was the hardest thing I've ever done. But the hardest tests weren't the financial ones, or the logistical nightmares. The hardest tests were the tests of my own spirit. There were moments, many of them, where the old ego would rear its head, a competitor would spread a nasty rumor. And my first instinct was to lash out. I'd hear through the grapevine that my husband's company was struggling, and a little voice would whisper, "Good, let him fail." That was the temptation, to let this new venture become just another weapon in the same old war. I had to learn a new way of operating. I called it practicing detachment. I had to run my business for the sake of the business itself, for the quality of the product, for the well-being of my employees, for the satisfaction of doing a job. Well, I couldn't be emotionally tied to beating him. I had to make decisions based on what was right, not on what would hurt him or prove a point. It's a difficult thing to explain. It's like tending a garden. you don't tend it to show up the gardener, next door you tend it. Because you love the soil, the plants, the process, you do the right thing for the garden regardless of whether your neighbor's garden thrives or withers. That's righteous action, you act rightly, because it is the right way to act, not because you're expecting a certain outcome. The years passed, my small company grew steadily organically. His company, built on a more aggressive, ego-driven model, started to show cracks. The market shifted, and his rigidity became a liability. When the first merger offer came from his board, it was a lowball, a desperate attempt to absorb us and save themselves. My team was outraged. They wanted me to fight to publicly humiliate them. But I just saw it as a business problem. I knew our companies were complementary, a merger a real one not. My lawyer spoke first. Mr. Evans, this is the principal buyer, the CEO of Apex Logistics Solutions. Takeover made strategic sense. It would create something stronger, more stable, and save a lot of jobs on his side. The day the acquisition was finalized, people expected me to be triumphant. They expected a victory speech. But I felt nothing like that. Sitting across the table from him, in the lawyer's office, was one of the strangest experiences of my life. He looked smaller, the bluster was gone, replaced by a kind of weary defeat. And I didn't feel victory. I felt a profound sense of compassion. I saw a man who was a prisoner of his own ego, who had built a castle, only to find himself trapped inside its walls. His identity was so tied to that company, to being the successful one, the provider, the boss. He was losing the very thing that defined him. I had already lost that. And in losing it, I had found something infinitely more valuable. When I bought his company, it wasn't an emotional victory. It was a practical decision. It was the best path forward for both entities. It was the final act of letting go. I wasn't acquiring his company to own a piece of him. I was integrating assets to build a better future for an enterprise I believed in. The moment the papers were signed, I felt a weight lift that I didn't even know I was still carrying. It was the last thread of that old identity finally snapping. Afterwards, I went for a walk. I didn't go to a fancy restaurant or call anyone to celebrate. I just walked. The air felt different, lighter. I realized that true success had nothing to do with the name on the building or the size of the bank account. True success was this feeling, this inner freedom, this peace. I had transcended the entire need for external proof. I didn't need to be seen as successful anymore. I didn't need to prove him wrong. His words, "Y'all never make it without me," had lost all their power. They were just sounds he made once a long time ago. Making it wasn't about the company making it, was the journey inward. It was finding that I was already whole, already complete. Long before the deal was ever signed, the acquisition was just paperwork. The real victory was the quiet certainty I felt walking down that street, finally, completely and peacefully alone. There was a long silence. The air was thick with it. He just stared at me. I didn't smile. I didn't gloat. I simply pulled out the chair opposite him and sat down. I looked at the document in front of me, then I looked at him. The argument started like they all did, over something small, a misplaced file. But it escalated quickly. He was stressed about the quarterly earnings, about a client we were on the verge of losing, and he turned to me, his voice cold and flat, and said, "You know, you should be grateful for this office, for this position. Y'all never make it without me. You don't have the instinct for it. The terms are as negotiated," I said, my voice steady. "It's a fair price for the assets." He was stammering. "You, this is you." "It is," I said. I picked up the pen. It felt heavy, significant. "This isn't about revenge, it's about good business. Your company has value, but it needs new leadership. It needs a new vision." I signed my name on the line. The signature was the same one Id used for years on his company's reports. But this time, it was mine, wholly, completely mine. I slid the document back to the lawyer. It was done. He was still staring, his face a mosaic of shock and a kind of bruised pride. I stood up. I didn't say another word to him. There was nothing left to say. The acquisition was the statement. The proof was in the paperwork. I had built something from nothing, piece by careful piece. I had made it without him. In fact, I had made it precisely because I was without him. I walked out of that room, and the silence that followed me was not the silence of an ending. It was the quiet, powerful sound of a beginning that was entirely my own. The house was always so quiet after he left for work. It wasn't just the lack of sound, it was the weight of the silence. It felt heavy, like a blanket smothering everything. I'd move from room to room, tidying things that were already tidy, and I could feel this smallness, like I was shrinking to fit the space he allowed me to occupy for years. It was like living in a shadow. I didn't cast myself, my opinions were suggestions. He could dismiss my ambitions, were little hobbies he tolerated. I felt like a satellite. Orbiting his sun, my own light, dimmed to near nothingness. I didn't even realize how much of myself I had packed away, just to keep the peace. The words themselves didn't come out of nowhere, they were the final brick in a wall he'd been building between me and my own life. For a decade we were in the kitchen. I remember the cold feel of the tile under my feet. I had finally worked up the courage to tell him about the business plan. I'd been working on it in secret for months. Late at night, after everyone was asleep, I laid it all out on the table, my voice shaky, but determined. I showed him the numbers, the market research, my vision. He didn't even look at the papers, he just smiled, this patronizing, pitying smile. It was the smile you give a child who tells you they're going to fly to the moon. And then he said it so calmly, so sure of himself. Honey, he said, be realistic, y'all. Never make it without me. It wasn't shouted, it was worse than that. It was a statement of fact delivered with this absolute, unshakable certainty. In that moment, it wasn't just a comment on a business plan, it was a verdict on my entire being. It was him. It wasn't the anger in his voice that did it, it was the calm certainty, the absolute conviction that I was an accessory to his success. And in that moment, something in me just shut down the hurt, the frustration. It all solidified into something else, something hard and clear. And focused. It was like a switch flipped, the emotion drained away. And all that was left was a simple, cold fact: he was wrong, and I was going to prove it, not for him. But for me, the goal wasn't to win an argument anymore, it was finally saying out loud what I had felt for years, that I was inadequate, that I was nothing without his reflection. The immediate aftermath was like a physical blow. I felt the air leave my lungs. The anger came first, a hot, sharp sting. But it was quickly drowned by this cold, spreading numbness, a profound crisis of confidence. Because a part of me, a deep hidden part, believed him. That was the real devastation, the fear that he was right, that I was just playing at being a capable adult. And he was the only one who could see the truth. I spent the rest of the day in a daze. I'd look at my own reflection in the window and not recognize the person staring back. Who was I if I wasn't the woman he defined me as? For weeks I moved through my life like a ghost, but those words, they started to curdle inside me. The pain turned into something else, a stubborn, defiant ember. It was fragile, but it was there. I'd be folding laundry, and I'd hear his voice in my head: y'all never make it. And instead of crumbling, I'd feel this jolt, this raw, pure refusal to accept that as my truth. The decision to channel that pain into purpose didn't feel heroic. It felt like a survival instinct. It was the only way forward that didn't involve completely disappearing. Taking the first step was terrifying. Every single action was a battle. Opening a business bank account felt like a rebellion. Renting a tiny windowless office felt like I was committing a fraud. And the self-doubt was a constant whispering companion. It wore his voice every time I hit a snag, every time a client was hesitant. The voice was there: see, I told you, you don't have what it takes. You're in over your head. I'd have to stop, put my head down on the desk, and just breathe. I'd have to consciously fight back. With evidence, with tiny hard-won facts, I got the business license, I designed the logo, I answered the phone, small concrete things that his voice couldn't erase. Then came the first small victory, my first client. It wasn't a big account, nothing that would change the world, but it was mine. I found them, I pitched them, I won them. I remember putting the phone down after they agreed, and my hands were shaking. It was proof, tangible, undeniable proof, that I could do something, that I had a skill he hadn't given me. That first client led to a second, then a referral. Each problem I solved, each invoice I sent, each thank you from a satisfied customer. It was like laying down a new floorboard over the shaky ground of my old self. My confidence wasn't given to me. I was building it brick by brick with my own 2 hands. There was a moment about a year in when everything shifted. I was working late, completely absorbed in a project I was genuinely excited about. I had forgotten to eat, I had forgotten to check the time, and I realized I hadn't thought about him or his words for the entire afternoon. The business had stopped being about proving him wrong. The fire of anger had burned down, and what was left was a genuine warmth for the work itself. I was doing this for me, because I was good at it, because it made me feel to win. Alive. That was the real awakening. The journey became about self-discovery. I learned I was more resilient than I ever knew. I learned I could be sharp in negotiations, patient with clients, and creative under pressure. I discovered a strength that had been there all along, buried under layers of doubt. and someone else's definition of me. I was learning my own dimensions, and they were so much bigger than I had been led to believe. From this new place of strength, I could look at his company, the one he had always treated as his empire, with a kind of detached clarity. It wasn't this imposing, formidable thing anymore. I could see its weaknesses, its outdated strategies. I observed it not from a place of hurt or envy, but from a place of professional interest. The emotional distance was the final sign of my healing. He was no longer the giant whose shadow I lived in. He was just a man who ran a business, and not a particularly innovative one at that. When the opportunity to acquire his company arose, it felt less like a takeover and more like a natural progression. It was a sound business decision. But of course it was symbolic too. It was me buying back my own sense of value. It was the ultimate rebuttal to his prophecy, not because it was a victory over him, but because it was the final solid proof of my own independence. The encounter with him after the deal was finalized was nothing like I might have imagined in my angrier days. There was no scene. We met in a neutral conference room. He looked older and tired. There was no anger in his eyes, just a kind of bewildered respect. We talked for a few minutes, just business, the necessary formalities. But then he paused, and he looked at me, really looked at me, maybe for the first time in 15 years. He said, "You've built something remarkable," and I simply said, "Thank you." There was no gloating, no, "I told you so." The need for that had vanished months ago. The conversation was marked by a quiet confidence on my part, a peace that came from knowing my own worth, completely separate from his acknowledgement of it. Sitting alone in my own much larger office, I finally allowed myself to reflect. The journey was never about him, it was about me. It was about proving something to the one person who truly needed the proof, myself. The acquisition of his company wasn't the victory. The victory was every morning I got up and chose to believe in myself, even when it was hard. The victory was the reclamation of a voice I had let grow quiet. His statement, "Y'all never make it without me," was meant to be a prison. But it turned out to be the key. It was the shock that jolted me awake, that forced me to look in the mirror and finally see the capable, resilient woman who had been there all along. The penthouse was quiet, the kind of quiet that only expensive soundproofing can create. Outside, the city glittered, a carpet of diamonds laid out just for us. I stood by the floor-to-ceiling window, holding a crystal glass of something amber and old. It was the life Wed built, or rather the life he had built. And I was permitted to inhabit the art on the walls, the designer furniture, the view. It was all a testament to his success. My role was to be the elegant accessory, the charming hostess, the supportive wife. I started that night in the silence of the house after he'd gone to sleep. I took a blank notebook, the kind with grid lines I've always preferred for planning. The first page was just questions. What are the biggest complaints our clients have? The ones they only whisper to me. Where are the bottlenecks in his company's operations that he's too proud to fix? What niche did he consider beneath him, but that had real untapped potential? I mapped it all out. I knew his business better than he did because I was the one. And for a long, long time, I played it perfectly. He was at his desk, a massive slab of polished black wood. The glow from his monitor illuminated his face, all sharp angles and cool confidence. We'd been talking about a charity gala, something trivial. Then the conversation shifted, veering into the dangerous territory of my own aspirations. Id mentioned cautiously an idea. I had a software solution for supply chain logistics, something Id been researching quietly for months. It was a good idea, I knew it was. He didn't even look up from his screen, he just let out a short dismissive laugh. "That's a cute hobby, darling. But let's be realistic, this world, it's a shark tank. You're a goldfish. A very well-kept goldfish." He finally swiveled his chair to face me, and his expression wasn't cruel. Not exactly, it was worse. It was utterly, unshakably certain. "Y'all never make it without me." The words hung in the sterile air. They didn't feel like an insult in that moment. They felt like a diagnosis, a final, irrevocable verdict. And in the silence that followed, something in me solidified. The part of me that had been pleading, hoping for a partner, simply shut down. And a colder, sharper part woke up. If this was a shark tank, then I would stop being a goldfish. I would learn to breathe the water. I would become the shark. That night the war was declared, not with shouting, but with silence. He went back to his work, believing the matter settled. I stood by the window, and I began to plan his downfall. The first step was absolute secrecy. I couldn't use my own name, our shared accounts, or any traceable assets. I found a small, unremarkable office space in a different part of the city, A place you would never think to look. I rented it under a newly formed LLC, a name I crafted carefully to be bland and forgettable. That office became my command center. By day, I was still the wife. I attended his events. I smiled at his colleagues. I discussed the markets with his investors, all while carefully absorbing every piece of information I learned who was loyal, who was dissatisfied, where the pressures were in his business model. By night and during the hours, he thought I was at yoga, or with friends I was building my empire. The financial chess game was the most delicate part. I needed capital, a lot of it. But I couldn't just withdraw millions without setting off alarms. So I started small. I used a modest inheritance from my grandmother that he'd always considered a triviality. I liquidated jewelry he'd given me pieces I never really loved. I found a few very quiet, very private angel investors, people who cared more about the disruptive potential of my idea than about my personal life. They were a risk, but everything was a risk. My company, which I named Etha Logistics, began to operate in the same sector as his, but with a leaner, more agile structure. I hired a skeleton crew of brilliant, hungry people who were disillusioned with the corporate giants. We developed the software it envisioned, but better, faster, more intuitive. And then we started to compete, not head-on, not at first. We would identify his company's smaller clients, the ones who felt neglected or overcharged. We would offer them a superior product at a low. In the trenches, I knew its weaknesses like the back of my hand. Price, it was a strategy of 1,000 cuts. We were a ghost bleeding his empire slowly, silently. Every client we stole was a tiny victory. He never even noticed. He'd come home and complain about aggressive new competitors, about a shifting market, and I'd nod sympathetically, pouring him a drink, all while my heart raced with a secret, ferocious joy. This double life required a constant, exhausting performance. I had to be two people. The public face was all softness and support. The private commander was all steel and strategy. There were close calls. Once he saw a document on my iPad I'd forgotten to close a financial projection for Etha. I told him it was market research for a stock portfolio. I was dabbling and he bought it, of course. Why wouldn't he? I was just his wife playing with investments. The facade held, but it was a constant highwire act. The stress was a physical thing, a tightness in my chest that never fully went away. But it was fuel, every doubt, every moment of fear. I would just replay his words in my head: "Y'all never make it without me," and I would push harder. The turning point came about 18 months in my network. My quiet inquiries finally paid off. I discovered the fatal flaw in his company's foundation. It was debt, not just any debt, but a huge short-term loan he'd taken out to finance an acquisition, a loan that was coming due in 6 months. The acquisition had underperformed. The revenue he'd projected to pay back the loan hadn't materialized. He was vulnerable, desperately vulnerable. He was trying to quietly refinance, but the lenders were getting nervous. This was the chink in his armor. This was checkmate. I didn't attack immediately. A predator knows when to strike. I began to engineer the crisis through a series of shell companies and intermediaries. My business started applying pressure exactly where it hurt. We aggressively pursued his most profitable remaining clients. We launched a marketing campaign that highlighted his company's outdated technology. We made it known in the industry that Etha was the future, and his firm was the past. We were creating a narrative, a story of a company in decline. The stock price, which had already been soft, began to dip. Then, it began to fall. The vultures started to circle. The financial news outlets began to run speculative pieces. The pressure was mounting, and I watched from my hidden office, orchestrating it all. The day the loan came due, he was a ghost of himself, pale, distracted, snapping at his staff. He thought he was fighting market forces, bad luck. He didn't know he was fighting me. He spent that day frantically trying to secure a bailout, a last-minute refinance. But the banks were closing their doors. The risk was too high. That's when I made my move. My investors and I had been preparing for this. We assembled a war chest, we formed a consortium, and made a hostile takeover bid for his company. The offer was reflecting the current battered stock price, but it was the only offer on the table. It was a lifeline, and it was thrown by a hand he never saw coming. The board of directors, facing total collapse, had no choice but to recommend the offer to the shareholders. The vote was a formality. The company was mine. The final act was the board meeting called to ratify the sale. He was required to be there, of course. As the outgoing CEO, I dressed with more care than I ever had, a sharp, severe black suit. No jewelry, my hair pulled back. I looked like what I had become, a CEO. The next phase was the foundation. I had a small inheritance from my grandmother tucked away, in a savings account. He never bothered to ask about it, lost a fortune. But it was a seed. I became a ghost of my former financial self. I packed my lunch every day. I stopped buying coffee out. I tracked every penny in a spreadsheet. It was a quiet, secret game. I opened a separate bank account. And I started funneling every spare dollar into it. I reached out to a few people very carefully, a former client who. I walked into the boardroom last. The atmosphere was thick with defeat and anxiety. He was at the head of the table, his head in his hands. He looked up as I entered. And for a second, there was a flicker of confusion. Why was I here? Maybe he thought I'd come to support him, to hold his hand through the humiliation. He started to say something weak. What are you doing here, honey? Then my lawyer placed the documents on the table. I didn't sit next to him. I walked to the other end of the table, the head opposite his. And I took the seat. I looked at the board members. Then I looked directly at him. The confusion on his face was absolute. It was almost pitiable. Then it began to shift slowly. As the pieces clicked into place, the mysterious competitor, the aggressive tactics, the perfectly timed collapse, the anonymous buyer, the disbelief, was the first thing to wash over him then. A dawning, horrifying comprehension. His eyes widened, the color drained from his face, completely. He looked at me, truly looked at me for the first time in years, and he saw a stranger. He stammered my name. It wasn't a question, it was a plea, a denial. I didn't smile. I didn't gloat. I simply nodded to the chairman of the board. The acquisition is complete, the man said, his voice uneasy. The new majority owner and CEO of this company is present. The floor is yours. The room was silent. All eyes were on me. I placed my hands flat on the table. Thank you, I said, my voice calm, clear, and utterly steady. It was the voice of someone who had indeed made it. The first order of business is a restructuring plan. We'll begin with a review of all outstanding debt and a reassessment of our strategic direction. I laid out a concise, brilliant plan for the company's future, a plan that demonstrated a deeper understanding of the business than he had ever possessed. It wasn't about vengeance, it was about validation. It was proof that the idea he had dismissed as a cute hobby was the very thing that would save the empire he had driven into the ground. He just sat there, shattered. The illusion was gone. The goldfish had swallowed the shark. And as I spoke, outlining the future, with a clarity and confidence that filled the room, I knew the victory wasn't in the ownership, or the money, or the power. The victory was in the silence that had replaced his certainty. The victory was in the simple, undeniable truth that now hung in the air between us. I had made it entirely without him. The background is something I never really talked about, not even to myself, for a long time. It was just the way things were when David and I started the company. It was his name on the door, his face in the press releases. I was the silent partner, the one in the background. I handled the client relations. I smoothed over the rough edges. With investors, I was the one who actually understood the operational flow that kept the whole machine running. He was the visionary, the big ideas man. And I was the foundation. The problem was the foundation is invisible. It's just expected to be there, holding everything up without any recognition. His comment that night, he said I'd never make it without him. It wasn't just a cruel thing said in anger, it was a diagnosis. It was the quiet, unspoken belief of our entire society finally spoken aloud. It was the belief that my role was supportive, ancillary, that I was the wind beneath his wings. But I could never be the pilot, that my contributions were the kind that facilitated success, but weren't success itself. And the realization that hit me weeks after I left wasn't just about my respected my work ethic, a freelance accountant. I trusted implicitly. I built a tiny silent network. Their loyalty was to me, not to the company I represented. Marriage, it was a cold, clear understanding that my personal struggle was a single thread in a much larger tapestry, a pattern of gendered underestimation, woven so deeply into the fabric of everything that most people don't even see it. My fight wasn't just with David, it was with a system that had trained him and me to believe that was my rightful place. The first thing I did after the initial shock wore off was I went looking for other women, not for sympathy, but for strategy. I knew I couldn't navigate this alone, and I certainly couldn't use the old rulebook, the one written by. And for men, I found a mentor, a leaner, who had built her own tech firm in the 90s, when it was even more of a boys' club. She didn't offer platitudes, she showed me her scars. She taught me about financial structures that wouldn't leave me vulnerable, about negotiation tactics That countered the perception of female aggression, about the importance of building a board that reflected the world I wanted to build for. That lesson became the core of my new company. It wasn't just about building a successful business. It was about building a different kind of business. I was deliberate. I hired women. I promoted women. I sought out female-owned supply chains and vendors. I fostered a culture that wasn't about cutthroat competition, but about collaborative problem-solving. We had a policy of radical transparency. When it came to salaries, we built in flexibility for parents, for caregivers, and what happened was remarkable. The talent that flocked to us was incredible. Women who were tired of hitting the glass ceiling elsewhere, who were exhausted from having their ideas credited to male colleagues. We created an engine of innovation precisely because we valued every voice. And that network expanded outward. Our clients, many of them also women-owned businesses, became partners in a real sense. They believed in the mission. They weren't just buying a product. They were investing in a principle. That female-driven network, this web of mutual support and shared ambition, became our most powerful asset. It was a force that the traditional male-dominated business world simply didn't understand and couldn't compete with. They were playing chess, and we were building a new game entirely. The success of the company, the rapid growth, the profitability, all of it, was a statement. It was living proof that female leadership isn't just about fairness or equality as abstract concepts. It's about effectiveness. It's about results. Our numbers spoke a language that even the most skeptical investor could understand. We proved that a company built on empathy, on clear communication, on a rejection of toxic hierarchy, could not only survive, but thrive in a brutal market. We were shattered. Glass ceiling, not by asking for permission to enter the room, but by building a better room right next door. Then came the opportunity to acquire David's company. His firm had stagnated. The old-school model was failing. The big ideas weren't so big anymore without the invisible foundation to support them. The acquisition wasn't just a business decision. It was the ultimate symbolic victory. This wasn't a woman leaning in to get a seat at the table. This was a woman buying the table, the chairs, and the entire building. It was a woman not just entering the boardroom, but taking charge of it the moment I walked in. That boardroom, for the first time as the owner, the air shifted. The symbolism was so thick you could taste it. It was a quiet, powerful reversal of that night. He told me I'd never make it. The first client was the hardest. It was a small account one my husband's company had overlooked. I pitched my new unnamed consultancy. I promised a level of personal service and operational clarity they'd never received. I worked on their project at night, on weekends, delivering something so flawless. It almost felt like an apology for how much extra work I was doing. When the first payment hit my secret account, it wasn't about the money. It was a validation, a signal that I was on the right path. I knew the media would want to frame it as a revenge story. The scorned wife buys out her ex-husband's company, a juicy personal drama. But I controlled that narrative. My PR team and I were very specific. We focused the story on the business achievement, on the numbers, on the innovative model my company represented. We talked about the acquisition as a strategic merger, a consolidation of assets that made sound financial sense. We gave interviews about leadership styles and market trends. We deliberately, meticulously drained the story of its personal salaciousness and reframed it as a case study in modern business. We made it boring in the best possible way, because the triumph wasn't in the personal gotcha moment. The triumph was in the professional validation. The point wasn't that I beat him. The point was that the model I built was superior to the one he built. And that's when the real work began. The success, the platform, the resource, they weren't an end point. They were a starting point. My new mission became paying it forward. We established a foundation, funded entirely from the proceeds of the acquisition, dedicated to providing seed money for women entrepreneurs, not just money, but the kind of mentorship I had received from a leaner. We paired them with advisors. We provided legal and accounting support. We created a network so they wouldn't have to start from zero like I did. We were building a pipeline, a highway for women with ideas, to bypass the old broken roads. I spend a lot of my time now mentoring the next generation. I sit with young women bright-eyed and full of fire, and I tell them the unvarnished truth. I tell them about the moments of doubt, the times I almost gave up, the specific challenges they will face that their male counterparts will not. I share the hard-won lessons about contract law, about venture capital, about protecting your intellectual property. I try to make the path easier, to signpost the pitfalls so they can avoid them. It's about creating Legacy that is bigger than any one company. The final message, the one I hope people take from this story, is that individual defiance is necessary, but it's not sufficient. My story only has meaning if it becomes a blueprint, if it inspires another woman to look at the invisible role she's been assigned, and decide to step into the light, if it encourages a group of women to pool their resources and build something together. The goal was never just to prove David wrong. That was a small personal battle. The real victory is in the collective progress. It's in the slow, steady, irreversible shift of the landscape. It's about turning my solitary act of defiance into a chorus of voices, each one adding to a new manifesto, a new set of rules written not for us, but by us. The story isn't about one woman buying a company. It's about what she does with it after. It's about using the keys to the boardroom to unlock doors for everyone else still waiting in the hall. Are you being underestimated right now? Maybe it's a partner, a boss, a colleague. That feeling, that quiet dismissal, it can either crush you or it can become your fuel. This step is about choosing the fuel. It's not about proving them wrong, not yet. That comes later. First, it's about proving something to yourself. You need to separate your real goal from the reactive anger. The anger is useful, it's energy, but it can't be the foundation. So let's start with a journal. Get a notebook, a dedicated one. On the first page, I want you to write down the exact words that were said to you. Y'all never make it without me. Write it down, stare at it. Then on the next page, I want you to answer this question and be brutally honest. Why do you want to succeed? Is it to shove it in their face? That's part of it, and that's okay, but